Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Hall, Director of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's program. We are here tonight to celebrate the end of a wonderful exhibition, and I hope that if some of you haven't been in to see the show, that you manage to come in and see it before it closes on Sunday. In the meantime, I just mentioned this a little bit, but we've discovered something over the last few months of the pandemic, and that is that the museum is more than a building. It is the work we do, and it is the ways we connect with the public. So I'm really happy that we can record this and have it become part of our online library of content that we have on our website and our YouTube channel. And if anyone's been on our YouTube channel, we just did, Jillian McMaster just did some upgrades to it, so it looks better. It's easier to find. You can see the content much more immediately. You used to have to go through a couple screens to find things. So you can find us, and you can find a lot of terrific programs that we have put together since March. I'm also happy tonight that I get to introduce everyone to this program and then bow out and let Daniel do the talking, because Daniel and I have been co-hosting a program called Let's Talk Art monthly, in which we both share the presenting, and it'll be nice for me tonight to be part of the audience. So I'm going to give you a little information about Daniel, and then he's going to take over. So Dr. Daniel Fulco has been the Agnita M. Stine Schreiber Curator at the museum since 2017. I've been enjoying working with him since my arrival 6 months ago. He is a graduate of Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut, with a degree in art history and a museum studies certificate. Prior to coming to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, he was assistant director and curator of the New Britain Museum of American Art in New Britain, Connecticut. And he went on to receive his master's and PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He also gained experience at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. as a curatorial intern and as an assistant in the Visual Resources Collection of the University of Illinois while he was there. He also has teaching experience at Marymount University, the University of Maryland, and Howard Community College. And of course, he's always teaching us at the museum, teaching the public, teaching the docents, teaching fellow staff members, which we love. His academic specialty is Italian Baroque art, but here in Hagerstown, he works with an expansive, eclectic collection of more than 6,500 works from varying cultures and time periods. Some of his recent projects include organizing the museum's very successful exhibition, The Blues and the Abstract Truth, Voices of African American Artists, which he organized in collaboration with colleagues at the David Driscoll Center. He was very busy this summer on lockdown curating. As travel schedules for touring exhibitions collapsed, he organized 2 exhibitions, largely from our permanent collection, so that when we reopened, we had fresh exhibitions for the public. I will say something that I have personal experience with. A curator at a small museum does so much. That's part of the reason it's a wonderful job, but it's also exhausting. Daniel is giving this talk tonight. Just 3 hours ago, he handed in a catalog essay for our upcoming Joshua Johnson exhibition. He is a dedicated colleague who juggles his many responsibilities gracefully. He's also my co-host of Let's Talk Art. So if you want to learn more about him, go on YouTube and find our first episode, and you get a really nice introduction to how he got interested in art history and started his career. So in the meantime, he will take us into the world of Rembrandt and his contemporaries, and I will be quiet now.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Sarah. And thank you very much to everybody for joining us tonight. I'm in one moment here, I'm going to share my screen with you. And it is my great pleasure to, as we wrap up our exhibition called The Dutch Golden Age Prints by Rembrandt and His Contemporaries, be able to speak to you a little bit about this artist and his importance in the history of art in general. But then we'll also be looking at some of the selected prints from the exhibition. And this is really an outstanding show for those of you who live nearer to Hagerstown. I really encourage you to come and see it before it closes on the 24th. These works of art are really outstanding. And while some of you do know about this, the exhibition has been loaned to us by the Reading Public Museum in Pennsylvania. So the works I'm going to go through in the second half of the presentation tonight are all drawn from their collection, which were primarily purchased or they were donated to that specific museum. And this slide here just shows you a couple of samples from that we're going to be looking at tonight. But before I go into talking about Rembrandt, I just want to situate us in the cultural and historical context that we're looking at tonight, and that is the Dutch Golden Age. You might ask yourself, so what was this? Well, it was a period in 17th century Europe where the former Dutch Republic went through a remarkable period of growth and cultural expansion. It was a period in which works of art were produced on a very vast scale, both small scale and large scale. And this was the result of the Dutch growing both within and also from without. And by that, I mean that they started to expand and establish a colonial or overseas empire, which brought them to places like the Americas, but also the East Indies. The subjects that we're going to be looking at tonight deal with a variety of concerns. Some of them have to do with issues of domesticity. The Dutch Golden Age also, as you're going to see, has to do with something called conspicuous consumption. And by that, I mean that the Dutch are very much preoccupied with depicting the things around them, aspects of daily life. And by that, we can also infer something having to do with materialism. The locations we're going to be talking about vary. They include Leiden and Amsterdam. Those will be the focus, but at times I may also mention places like Harlem. These artists working within the Dutch Republic, and here we're focusing on the north, but I should also mention that in the south, in the southern Netherlands, we have down here also a lot of artistic production. We'll hit on it a little bit tonight in terms of at the time that was called Flanders and the people from there Flemish, but I thought that I would bring that up. The Netherlands was divided between the north and the south, south being Catholic, north primarily being Protestant and Calvinist. So if you keep in the back of your mind that this is the time in which Europe is still, to some degree, particularly during Rembrandt's early years, it's going through the Protestant Reformation. And I just bring this painting over here on the right-hand side to give you a sense of Dutch are masters of the high seas. And there are a lot of Dutch seascapes that were depicted at the time. This shows some sailing vessels caught in some bad weather, but they were really outstanding at navigating the globe. And it's through this trade that they're going to bring back all kinds of art, ideas, culture, things from around the world that go beyond the borders of Europe. These points here just summarize some of the key themes and takeaways that I've been talking about. And the subjects we're going to go through tonight are very compelling. They include religious scenes, myths from classical mythology, depictions of everyday life, figure studies, and then finally we're going to sum up with some landscapes and genre scenes, or scenes from daily life. The prints primarily consist of etchings and engravings, and they're produced between about the late 1500s all the way up through the 1700s by followers of Rembrandt. We have to also realize at this time that Rembrandt and also his contemporaries worked in a very revolutionary printmaking style, and specifically Rembrandt, who starts to introduce these very innovative techniques during his day. And you're going to see how he was influenced by his predecessors, but also some of his contemporaries as well, and also how his successors are going to respond to that. Rembrandt, I can't state this enough, has such an impact on world art, particularly printmaking, but also painting. We're going to see how that works. This also, I should point out, Rembrandt and his contemporaries' creations are part of the Baroque, which is a style of Western art and architecture that is characterized by dramatic, emotional subjects, sometimes also elaborate decoration. And I was talking about the material culture for the Dutch, and this still life really helps to sum that up. It's by a man named Peter Kleis, and it shows a still life here with turkey pie. And you can see here that the Dutch trading brings back many different kinds of goods, like nautilus shells that are made into elaborate cups. Here is turkey, which may have come from Europe, possibly from further afield. Look at this beautiful Delftware, which was a kind of Dutch ceramic containing these fruits and also these plants that are placed here. It's a feast for the eyes. And all of that is laid on top of what looks like some kind of a Turkish or Central Asian textile. So the Dutch are very interested in the minute details of art. And you can see also how they depict all of the reflections of light off this, what looks like silver or pewter coffee or tea pitcher. Just outstanding. The Dutch Golden Age is characterized also by a pride in their landscape, in hard work, and in diligence. Dutch Calvinist values in many regards as we look at this view of Harlem by Jacob van Ruysdael, where church and faith are very much important, or as important as these farmers who are bleaching out linens, drying them in the sun. So this is part of the Dutch nationalistic pride. It's the age of artists like Johannes Vermeer, who came from Delft. And this is a woman holding a balance. We also have artists like Gert Tarborg in this painting that's very lovely called The Suitor's Visit, in which he's focusing very differently from Rembrandt, especially Rembrandt in his later years, on the silks and satins and the latest fashions of these people engaged in everyday interactions. Or, for example, Peter de Hoogh in his family portrait in an opulent interior. So this just gives you a sense of the kinds of pieces that were created at this time. And from there, we begin to look at an overview of Rembrandt's life and career. And then we're going to start looking at some prints from the show. But Rembrandt is born in a town called Leiden, and it's on the Rhine River. He grows up there, and he studies at first under several different artists. The first one is Jacob van Swanenburg, who specialized in cityscape paintings as well as scenes from the Bible. And then he also received training from a guy named Peter Lostman, who specialized in history painting. So Rembrandt gains the rudiments, if you will, of traditional art, but he's going to take those to the next level. And he, as you can see here, he's very confident in an early age in this etching from the early 1630s, in which he is starting to achieve the pinnacle of his career. That happens when he moves from Leiden after he studied with these two guys, and he relocates there. And at that time, he's going to become increasingly prosperous. And you can see that in this slide of Rembrandt's self-portrait as a burgher, where he's fashioning himself like his contemporaries. We have a copy of this painting that's in the Burrell collection in Scotland, and it's very interesting to note how he fashions himself, especially when he's young. And boy, does that change as time goes on. And he's very interested, as I said before, in his early years in depicting all the finery and experimenting with the possibilities of paint on canvas, and especially the contrast of light and dark. We're going to see how that works as we go on. By the time we get to the early 1630s, he buys himself a house, a very fashionable one, right in the center of Amsterdam. And this slide on the left shows the Rembrandt House Museum, where he originally lived. He's going to work out of the house. He's going to operate his printing press there, along with workshop assistants. And this painting on the right is a biblical subject, but it shows Rembrandt in all of his confidence with his wife Saskia at the time. He's raising up a glass, and he looks like he's having a grand old time. And it's very neat to see how the artist takes this traditional subject, but inserts himself and his wife into the picture. And you can see he's wearing all the latest fashions, all these expensive garments. He's even got this saber here at his side. You can see, again, one of those Central Asian or Turkish textiles there, and what looks like some kind of meal laid out on the table. So Rembrandt has very expensive taste, and this is going to cause him some problems as time goes on. But in those days in which he was really experiencing much prosperity, he really lived it up. And this is an example of some of the work from that time, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicolas Tope. The Dutch Golden Age is also a period in which you see a rise in art collection, and also the emergence of scientific circles in a number of different cities within the Netherlands, including Leiden, but also in Amsterdam as well. Amsterdam is also a publishing center. And it shows this doctor giving an anatomy lesson to his students. And at this time, Rembrandt is very interested in depicting those exacting details. Notice the costume is in some ways similar to what we saw Rembrandt wearing. And by creating this self-portrait of himself, he's trying to show people that he's achieved the same rank or status as his peers, of whom were living within the vicinity of him in Amsterdam. It also shows a tremendous fascination in what we sometimes call in the 17th century, the age of reason, with understanding the human condition and human anatomy. And this is really quite a neat painting. This will culminate by the time we get to 1642 with one of his most famous paintings called The Company of Captain Franz Bonning Kalk, more simply known as the Night Watch. And the Night Watch is a tour de force in the history of art. This painting has had much discussion and research done on it, gone through many restorations, one actually the last 2 years. It's in the collection of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And what's really revolutionary about it is the way that the light falls upon these two figures. You've got Captain Franz Bonning-Kalk, who's dressed in black there, and on the right, we've got Wilhelm von Reitenburg, who has the white costume. Essentially, this is a militia company of civic militia guards. In Dutch, they were known as Klavaniers. And they're shown coming out of the doorway of their meeting hall and spilling out literally into the theater space. Rembrandt really put a lot of time and effort into this picture. And unfortunately, things didn't go so well for him when he presented it to his two patrons. And the reason why was they were expecting something more like this. It was done by Frans Hals and Peter Kodde, called the Meager Company, in which they are represented in a very idealistic, very grand manner. And you can see over here how these figures, how different they are. The light is very bright on them. We don't see it cast the composition that is in all these shadows. And you see here this gentleman on the left, he's looking straight out at us. It's very different with Rembrandt. The overall composition is much darker. It, in certain ways, is more introspective. It's more mysterious. But that's not what his patrons wanted at the time. And as a result, Rembrandt sort of fell out of favor with these Dutch burghers. This cost him quite a bit of setbacks financially. And during the 1640s, going into the 1650s, he's also going to have a number of deaths in his family, including that of his wife, several children. This will lead him to create prints that are somewhat more brooding, and in which he starts to explore the contrasts of light and dark. And in art historical terms, we call this chiaroscuro. This is his Three Crosses print, the first state. And by a state, I mean that this is a plate, an individual plate on which he was working. And Rembrandt would rework the plates in different ways. I'll come back to etching processes a bit later. But essentially what he's doing is he's manipulating the amount of ink that he has applied to each of these copper plates. And what that does is it achieves different kinds of tonalities, almost like a photograph in certain ways. And for those of you who joined us for the Let's Talk Art program on Tuesday, we were trying to talk about these things as well, in terms of the immediacy of what Rembrandt was doing with his prints. Look at it in the fourth state. In this case, the plate has been re-inked and completely remanipulated. It's much darker. The overall impression of this biblical scene is very different. These kinds of experimental techniques would exert considerable impact on artists coming down through the centuries, down through artists like Goya, for example, and even Picasso, as we discussed earlier in the week. And look at how different it is once we get to Rembrandt's Self-Portrait from 1658. What a contrast to the earlier days with Saskia. It's really quite a turn. We have a more brooding and introspective, melancholic artist, dressed in very elaborate robes and costume, almost in Middle Eastern style dress, but not at all in the same way, but here with the optimism, the positivism. And indeed, that would culminate in the 1660s, not long before Rembrandt's death in the late 1660s, with his painting The Conspiracy of Claudius Civilis, which was intended to be put in the Amsterdam Town Hall, but unfortunately was not liked by his patrons, by the civic officials. And therefore, Rembrandt was forced to remove it, and he had to cut down this composition, which is shown here on the right, and sell it in order to support himself. He was in great financial difficulties at the time. It also resulted in the sale of his printing press, which must have been dealt a great blow to him as we explore his prints today. But the reason is Rembrandt's style, applying paint and looking at how do we represent the world around us, how do we reimagine biblical scenes, really was at odds with the style prevailing at the time. As you can see, it's a very direct approach. These are figures drawn from the streets, for example. They're ordinary individuals. There's this sort of gritty quality to it that his patrons for official commissions did not approve of. But nevertheless, the legacy of Rembrandt really lives on. Now what we're going to do is look at some of the examples from the Dutch Golden Age exhibition. It begins with showing prints from really the late Renaissance and the very early Baroque period, such as Peter Jan Sanderdam's Parable of the Wise and Foolish Virgins that you see here on the left, drawn from the Bible. And you can see at this time, this one is an engraving, which is a bit different from an etching. Both of them are intaglio processes, but the engraving is in some ways a little bit different. It is it's a style of print in which actually much more fine detail is rendered. And you can see that where you can get all of these subtleties really in the shading. And it's really a preferred kind of print for doing this kind of very detailed scene. And oftentimes they're used in rendering architecture and in landscape as well. Etching, to achieve this kind of detail, is much more difficult. Look at how the artist here has sort of added all the detail to the foliage, the trees, and also the contrasts in the light and the dark. It's really quite amazing. Other artists whom Rembrandt would have been influenced by and whom he collected, I should mention that Rembrandt is also a collector, and he has many of these late Renaissance and early Baroque prints in his collection. Sadly, like with the printing press, because of his financial difficulties, he would have to liquidate much of his collection later in life. And this is a work by a guy named Schelte Bolsward after Abraham Blomert, and it's called The Prodigal Son Hiring Himself to a Farmer. And the reason I show this print is because it's a Dutch artist looking at a biblical scene, but what he's doing is, instead of making it sort of classical, like we saw here with the center down, sort of removed from everyday life, he brings us into the everyday condition of Dutch peasants. And you can see here that we almost could imagine this taking place on some kind of a farm in Holland. This is what would appeal to Rembrandt's sensibility, this type of print. You also have artists like Jan van de Velde with his depiction of St. Francis that represents these kind of earlier works that Rembrandt would have been familiar with. Other artists include Jan van Wonderzo, who is Flemish, and he did this after David Finkbones. I should point out that this print is in the museum's collection. And for this, I bring it in and you're going to see the comparison. Rembrandt is going to pick up on this Dutch-Flemish tradition of casting the biblical subjects within a Northern European landscape, whereby the narrative of the scene is almost subjugated to the overall aspects of nature. The artist here is really interested with the natural environment, and the figures are very tiny. But what's remarkable is also the contrast between light and darkness. This one also is an engraving. And you can see that how Rembrandt's picking up on that in this work that's in the shell called The Enunciation to the Shepherds, which is really a remarkable print. It's one of my favorites in the exhibit, where we see the shepherds down here below. And there we have the angel appearing, announcing the birth of Christ. And then up here we have the dove representing the Holy Spirit, a burst of these little babies, or putti, who are almost spilling out into our space. And look at the light of the angel, and also in the heavens, as opposed to the dark landscape of the night below. You can make out a bridge and some kind of a castle or a fortified town in the distance. So this shows you Rembrandt's use of that chiaroscuro technique, those tonalities that fascinate him so much. One thing to mention is that Rembrandt starts to work in the medium of etching around 1632, and actually about 1628 to 32. So this is a very early example of his printmaking technique. But when you put the Wonderzo and the Rembrandt Enunciation side by side, you can see how he's continuing this tradition, albeit Rembrandt's landscape is certainly anchored in the north. And look here, we have the palm trees. We have Wonderzo reimagining some kind of a Mediterranean landscape, but it's mixed with Gothic elements. It's sort of a fantasy image drawn from nature. Another very powerful work in the exhibition earlier on in his career, Christ driving the money changers from the temple. And this is really a dramatic one. It was when Christ was casting out these bad people, these money changers, expelling them from the temples described in the Bible. And there's a tremendous amount of chaos in the scene. We have a dog here that's barking, barrels, as well as a makeshift table that's been tipped over. The figures seem to be rushing to the left of the print, out of the space of the picture itself. And then over here, we have the high priests who are in the background, absorbed in their activities, to the point that they're sort of oblivious to what's going on over here. But these guys in the center have sort of started to notice, oh my God, something is really going on here. And you'll notice that Rembrandt really does a great job of combining both the thinly hatched lines with the cross hatchings that we see here to achieve different levels of light and dark, of tonalities. And the figure of Christ, in terms of looking at Rembrandt's models, is very reminiscent of Albrecht Dürer's Christ, shown here and derived from the Small Passion, a woodcut from well over 100 years earlier. So there's no doubt that Rembrandt was quite familiar with German Renaissance prints as well, and he may have owned some of them too. But for the gesture of Christ with that whip shown there, we can see that connection. Now we move to another one of these very powerful prints. It's very interesting that Rembrandt based upon one of his earliest signed paintings called The Stoning of St. Stephen. And St. Stephen was an important figure in the early Christian church, a martyr who was executed for blasphemy in Jerusalem. And you're looking at the print up here on the right that's in the exhibition. And look at how different it is from his painting from earlier in his career. This is done right around 1625, about 10 years earlier. And what's really neat is Rembrandt inserts himself right over here. And he's working very much in the style of his master, Peter Lostmann at the time, incorporating biblical architecture shown up above here, and also this Middle Eastern man, this sort of figure that looks like Rembrandt was looking at some kind of Turkish costumes, which he was known to have collected. So this is him sort of working out how to do a large scale painting like this at an early age. But the print is very different because it focuses right on this moment of St. Stephen, just before St. Stephen is about to be stoned to death. It's very dramatic. But here it's more highlighted, his face, that is, it's more idealized. This is much grittier, the print on the right. And here's a view of the print itself. This isn't the only time that Rembrandt would do prints and paintings that were directly related to one another. We also have the renowned Descent from the Cross, which is a fascinating work. Again, we have the figure of the Middle Eastern person shown here. And then you can see the light shining down from the heavens up above. This right over here, Descent from the Cross. But what's interesting is Rembrandt created a painting that you see here on the right after the print that he did before. So he's working in reverse from what he did with the stoning of St. Stephen. Again, tremendous contrast between light and dark. This, what's sometimes called tenebrism when we're talking about Italian Baroque art. And scholars often will argue that Rembrandt was very well aware of the artist Caravaggio, who is renowned for his tenebrism, that is very sharp chiaroscuro, that is the juxtaposition of light and dark. And the light in this almost seems to glow from within. It comes from the figures illuminating Christ as he's taken off the cross here. And the figures below react to another very interesting and mysterious light source down below. But it's very differently treated here in the print. Much of the light is focused here on this gentleman and also on the Christ and his the tormentors, as well as others who are shown here in the figure who are taking him off the cross. Another piece that's very interesting but is somewhat enigmatic is Dr. Faustus from 1652. This is later. This one deals with allegory. And by that I mean an abstract visual representation of an idea. This one has puzzled scholars for quite some time. While some argue that it reflects a play that was being put on in Amsterdam at the time called Dr. Faustus, others have said that it may have something to do with representing the limits of human knowledge in comparison to the clarity of divine wisdom. Divine wisdom being perhaps alluded to by this apparition here that has the INRI, or the initials of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So that's very interesting because Rembrandt is creating a print in which the meaning is not exactly clear. He's suggesting to viewers that perhaps there are multiple meanings or interpretations or readings that can be drawn out of this. Could it be Dr. Faustus, or is it an old man in his study, perhaps vaguely some kind of a saint, witnessing a sacred apparition here in the window? That's also what Rembrandt's part of. Baroque allegories, very complex complex layering of imagery. And this print really exemplifies that. It also allows us an opportunity to look at how he was contrasting areas of light and dark with the window, but also the blackened areas of the curtains in the wall of the room down below. And then also these very faintly rendered lines down below near the globe. Rembrandt was a great recorder of everyday life, and that included looking at people from the streets, such as old man seen from behind, profile to the right in a half figure. He would often capture these people on the street, and his prints, his etchings, of course, many of them were done back in his studio, in his workshop, but sometimes they have the impression as if he actually was incising onto his copper plate right on the spot, observing these people in their everyday activities. And to a certain degree, kind of is a sort of sympathizing with their condition, which is very interesting. I think he was really fascinated by these people, and they crop up in many of his works. He liked to be an observer of the everyday, that is the mundane, in this case, or perhaps a recollection, the golf player or the ring ball player. This was a sport that was played in 17th century Holland quite a bit. It was sort of like a game of croquet. And here we have this gentleman who's taking a rest, looks like inside of some kind of an inn, while his friends are outside conversing and getting ready to do another round of the game. Again, he's cast in shadows. And look at the economy of line here with the cross hatching. He's rendered these people outside so simply, yet so effectively. That's what adds to the immediacy. That's what grabs our attention. It's as if the moment might escape right away. So ephemeral. Same thing with his landscapes. 17th century Dutch art of the Golden Age, really deals a lot with the natural environment, looking outward. And here what Rembrandt does is create a print in which he sort of finished the right-hand side of the composition, but the left-hand side's not quite done yet. Is it deliberate? Is he doing that on purpose? Or is he just trying to show us the contrast, for example, between the sunlit area and perhaps this hut that is cast in shadow by a cloud that's obstructing the sun? Again, there's that ambiguity at work here. Now, Rembrandt had many competitors and contemporaries, and they included people like Jan Levens. And Jan Levens was a pupil of Rembrandt, and he worked in his workshop, learned many of his techniques, and would later, as you're going to see, do works after his master. This is one of St. Jerome and Penitents, an etching in dry point, in which the artist, again, is exploring those elements of chiaroscuro. Look at how the light bursts in these rays, extending outward from the head of the old saint, who has his head bowed down. He has a skull here, and he also has in his hand what looks like a crucifix. And he shows the simplicity, the humbleness of this individual who has removed himself from the material comforts of the world and is withdrawn to his cave in isolation. Here we have St. Anthony, also by Levens, another one in which you can really see the modalities and the contrast between the light and the dark and the shading, as well as the wonderful expression on his face, frozen in a moment, and how these clothes fall upon his body. Here we come to an artist named Jan van Vliet. And Van Vliet was somebody who was a competitor to Rembrandt, and he created many works that were sort of done after the master. This is a portrait of an old man that's sometimes referred to as a tronie, quote unquote tronie, or a character study. And in this case, it's very introspective, in which the man has his head facing down. He's not looking at us. He's lost in thought and contemplation. We can read his life to a certain degree through the wrinkles on his face. And this guy's physiognomy tells a story. You can even see also the tremendous detail, half his face cast in shadow against the beard shown on the right. You also have the laughing man in a gorget. A gorget is this kind of piece of sort of like an armored decoration that's placed around the neck, very commonly worn in the 17th century. And here Rembrandt is his followers kind of creating a humorous composition in which this man is caught again in a moment that's very fleeting, and he's making this sort of amusing expression as he looks out at us. And like Rembrandt had done in his paintings and also his prints, half of his face is cast in shadow, the other half cast in light. Or the German artist working in the 18th century, also following in the footsteps of Rembrandt, Georg Friedrich Schmidt, a portrait of a man. So originally, this kind of a print would have been done by Rembrandt. The plates somehow fell into this man's possession, or he may have made a copy after. He may have etched his own plate. I should mention that Rembrandt's plates were acquired by subsequent artists, publishers, and printers. They were restruck and reprinted, going all the way down through the late 19th, early 20th century in some cases. This was a print that we were discussing earlier this week in Let's Talk Art. It's one of my favorites in the exhibition, and it's the one on the left here. Captain William Bailey's done after Rembrandt, The Three Trees, in which he has reworked, this Irish artist has reworked Rembrandt's plate. This is Rembrandt's original composition on the right. And as one person had noted, several people have noted, these lines here in the upper left of the print are very mysterious in a certain way. Do they represent rain? Do they represent wind? Why are they there? And I think Rembrandt does this deliberately again. He makes marks on his etching plates. And then also we see them in the final print as a means of getting us to think about these fleeting effects that we see around us in the natural environment. In this case, he's observing the atmospheric effects of the sky, but it's not clear whether or not that's rain. Is it wind? That ambiguity is part of what makes his art so interesting. But what Bailey has done on the left-hand side is inserted these lightning bolts that burst out of the sky and almost strike these trees down, dangerously close. However, Rembrandt doesn't use this. You might ask yourselves why. The reason is that we're moving into the period here, when he's done this about 1750 to 1810, we're moving into the period of Romanticism, in which artists begin to explore the sublime and explore the awesome powers of nature to conquer or to frighten human beings. And that's kind of what you have going on here. However, as viewers, were able to view this from a safe distance. He's also reworked the clouds here, maintained though those sort of enigmatic lines on the right-hand side. And you'll note that he's reversed the image. He's reversed that when he reworked the plate. You'll also see figures, some cast in light over here. And while difficult to see in this image, there are two lovers over here next to this pond, very intriguingly. They're shown here also in this print. It's kind of hard to see. They're sort of hidden down below. And Rembrandt would do this sometimes in his prints. Again, the Dutch pride in the landscape, we can see windmills and a city or town in the distance. So a tour de force of a print indeed. Before we return to some of the others, I thought I would bring in one from our own collection here at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts of Joseph and Potiphar's Wife, which is really an interesting image. Again, it shows that tremendous contrast of light and dark. In this case, the sinful wife Potiphar, shown over here on the right-hand side, and Joseph, who's trying to resist her advances. What's really neat is in the Rembrandt house in Amsterdam, they have some of Rembrandt's copper plates. At the time, Rembrandt would have worked with these. Etchings are produced by heating a wax-like resin and then spreading it over the surface of a copper plate like you're seeing here. That creates an acid-resistant ground. Next, lines are drawn onto the wax, exposing the plate that is then submerged into acid. Only the exposed areas will be bitten or dissolved. And these etched areas would later, or could be later, inked for printing. And Rembrandt's style, as you can see here in the etching plate for this, is recognizable for those softly variated lines achieved by using a method called stopping out, in which he would apply the varnish to areas that were sufficiently incised, and he would thereby halt further etching and then re-exposing once the plate was put back into the acid. So this is some more technical information on how the process works. And it's really neat to see this. It's the reverse of what's going to come out in the printing press. But to show you the original image is very neat indeed. And I should also note, talking about Rembrandt being a collector, he had works by this Italian artist named Antonio Tempesta, who was a great intermediary between Belgium, between Flanders, and Italy. And he brought back many of these ideas dealing with Northern Renaissance art to Italy that influenced the development of the Italian Baroque. But it's believed that Rembrandt may have gotten some of his initial inspiration for the print that we have in our collection on the right from this one done by Tempesta, this etching on the left, from about the 1590s. And then you can see the two side by side. Now, apart from Rembrandt, this exhibition has a number of other fabulous works in it. And they include pieces by the painter and also printmaker named Karel Dujardin. And Dujardin is shown here on the right in a self-portrait that's in the Rijksmuseum. And we have this fabulous print. It's one of my favorite of the Dujardins in the exhibition, of landscape with tree exposed roots. In contrast to Rembrandt, Dujardin traveled quite a bit around Europe. He traveled in northern Europe, possibly Scandinavia, but also Germany and other spots on the continent. And it's believed he may have also spent some time in Italy. By doing that, what he was able to do was bring back different ideas about how the natural environment looked across different countries and cultures. And here he shows several travelers. This looks like perhaps a shepherd who's making his way through the countryside. And really very strangely and intriguingly, we see an exposed tree root here that has these eyes and almost is anthropomorphized. And by that, I mean that the natural surroundings, the tree itself, sort of is given these human or animalistic attributes. It has the look almost of a spider. And this is very unusual in Dujardin's work to do something like this. We also have the anthropomorphism of the two trees crossing one another. So it brings up some interesting questions about how artists try to infuse emotion and these sort of mystical ideas about the workings of nature into their prints. Other works by Dujardin include The Resting Place. He really liked to show humans and animals in the natural landscape, often in moments of contemplation and repose. Dujardin was, as I mentioned, a painter, and here's an Italian landscape with travelers on horseback from about 1660. And you can see how his style sort of oscillated and went between the two media, that is, between etching and oil painting. And a number of these artists worked in this manner. He was also, like some of his colleagues, part of a group of artists, Dutch artists, that went down to Italy called the Bent Vogels group. And these artists banded together down in Rome and became very much influenced by the trends in Italian, 17th century Italian landscape, but also the classical subjects prevalent in Italy at the time, like landscape with Venus and Adonis, which is a subject drawn from Ovid's Metamorphoses, a myth in which Adonis falls in love with Venus. And unfortunately, when Venus departs to go back up to Mount Olympus, Adonis foolishly engages in a confrontation with a wild boar. He's killed. Venus tries to come back to rescue him, but it's too late. But again, the narrative drawn from Ovid is subjugated, as we saw before in the Rembrandt print. It's subjugated to the overall powers of nature, of landscape. The artist, Dujardin, in this instance, is more interested in depicting his natural surroundings, particularly the trees, and then also the rolling hills that recede into the distance. We also have works by Cornelius de Fischer. This one is Shepardous on a Donkey that recalls classical pastoral poetry, for example, and the works of French artist named Claude Lorraine. We can think of his works. This shows a shepherdess on a donkey interacting a moment of daily life. The two of them engaged in some kind of conversation. And really, this is quite a beautiful print. This one is not an etching, though. It's actually an engraving. Again, the engraving often has this aspect that shows more detail. But this one almost has the qualities of an etching. This over here is a self-portrait of Fischer. And Fischer was also influenced again by these Italianate Dutch landscapes. Fischer also worked after another one of those Bent Vogels artists, the Dutch artists working down in Rome. one is really neat, and it's called the pistol shot. It's very dramatic. And you can see how Fischer, like Rembrandt, likes to explore the possibilities of chiaroscuro. It shows a group of bandits who are engaged in some kind of an attack and seem to be riding off on their horses out of the left of the composition. All of this takes place within a grotto or a cavern near some kind of a ruined building, perhaps a fortress. There's a gentleman over here who's drawing up a carriage. The exact nature of the events is uncertain, but whatever has happened, a man has been struck, likely killed, and he's fallen to the ground down below. You can see his saber here as well. So these artists work on a wide range of subjects. They're fascinated by animals, like Paulus Potter, in this noble portrait of these horses, and the pride both in the animals and the Dutch Republic is shown again here with this town in the background. Vast expanse of the water as well. Adrienne Funnell, another fascinating printmaker who's represented in the exhibition by this one, two gossips of two old women who stopped in the town center to converse with one another, exchange secrets about the latest happenings within town, while this peddler or fruit or vegetable salesman is selling food at a market in the background. And then over here, we have Franzau's portrait of the artist. Very fastly executed, beautifully done. And in our own collection, in a work that's on view at the moment, we also have Peasant with Pipe, and which is quite interesting. It's one of these characters. It's Ostara bringing us into the Dutch tavern, showing us aspects of everyday life. This is something that Jonas Zijderhof did with a group of peasants in an inn here, in which they are in the midst of a very bitter quarrel of some kind. It almost looks like somebody's going to hit somebody. And things are a bit in disarray. And this child has extended out his or her arm in an effort to try to calm down the situation. But this gentleman over here seems to be reaching for some kind of a weapon, leading us to believe that perhaps something terrible is going to happen. We also have works that deal with more mundane issues, such as a peasant settling his debt. And this one shows how Ostara really mastered this kind of Dutch interior with the windows, whereby the cross-hatching of the lines picks up on the timbers of the ceiling. It brings us right into the heart of a Dutch everyday scene, perhaps into the home, but likely more an inn or a tavern. And the composition, as you can see, relates to a painting that we have recently had conserved at the museum called Dutch Interior, of an oil on wood panel. And Ostara, like Peter Decker, shown here on the right, employed this kind of interior with the open windows, in which we have a glance at what's going on inside the room. And I would like to conclude here with a work by Cornelius Bager. I really am drawn to this because we don't exactly know what this man is reacting to. What is he doing? It's very introspective. He's gazing out of the window. He's looking down, but we don't know at what. And I should mention that Bager was a pupil of Ostara. So he was very interested in these everyday characters, these people that he spotted on the street, perhaps in his own town. And here I also like how the light is cast on this man as he's peering out of the window, perhaps being nosy or just watching some people pass by. In either case, it's quite fascinating. So thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed this journey through the Dutch Golden Age prints by Rembrandt and his contemporaries. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
So you can type, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can type them in the chat and I can unmute you and you can talk. Either way, I really enjoyed that. It was really nice for me, Daniel, to sort of be back in the whole scope of the exhibition again after having talked about a lot of different pieces of it over the last several months. It's really lovely. And we've also, Daniel worked really hard with the collections and curatorial team to install Dutch works from our permanent collection in the hallway of the museum adjacent to the print show. So you get a really terrific immersion in Dutch art if you manage to get to the museum before Sunday.
Hi, Susan and
Susan,
Sarah.
yeah.
This is my question. When does the exhibit close? And I got the answer this Sunday, right?
Yes, this Sunday, the 24th.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Quick question about RPM. On some of the images, the tribute is to RPM.
Purchase.
It's the
Yes.
Reading Public Museum.
I'm sorry?
That's the Reading Public Museum. That's where the exhibition
yes,
traveled.
yes. Gotcha.
Mhm.
Yeah. And if you see a WCMFA, that stands for Washington County Museum of Fine Arts.
So we have done, we did 3 different Let's Talk Art programs focusing on Dutch art. So if you found this interesting, you may really enjoy going back and watching those. Those are on our YouTube channel. I'm trying to think of what our various topics were. We did one where we really just talked about the Dutch Golden Age in fuller detail. I think our second one was we kind of positioned as kind of a travelogue. You get to see inside Rembrandt's house. You get to see sites in Amsterdam and Leiden associated with Rembrandt, and also the Singer Lauren Museum and the sort of roots of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts as we travel around Holland. And the last one we did just the other day, we had some printmakers join us and we talked about printmaking. So hopefully you guys can, on some night when you're making a complicated dinner, just stick your laptop on the counter and watch while you cook. That's what I tell everyone to do. Any other questions before we wrap up for the night?
Sarah, what are the museum hours through the weekend in case
Yes,
we want to go see the
It's
show?
10 to 4 on Saturday and 1 to 4 on Sunday. We do have slightly reduced hours through COVID. I've been telling everyone it's very safe to visit. It's actually kind of ideal because there's a lot of space and time for thinking and contemplation. You're not going to bump into too many other people.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, everyone. So we'll say good night. Thanks for joining us. Do go online and check out our other virtual experiences. And I have to put in a plug for Tablescapes, which is our next fundraiser that's happening throughout the month of February. You can go on our website, look at the amazing tablescapes that have been collected online this year. The designers made tables in their homes. And you can vote for your favorite table. That's one of the ways we raise money. The other way is simply through donations. And in fact, we have a preview cocktail party that I'm virtually hosting in this beautiful historic condo where you can join me for a drink on January 31st and get a sneak peek at some of the tables. And we're going to talk about museum memories. So I really enjoyed tonight, and thanks everybody who came online with us. And thank you so much, Daniel, for that.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, everybody.